So you have explained on numerous occasions why you think that Russia's attack on Ukraine was a rational decision from Putin. Could you please summarize your views about that for the Hungarian audience as well?
Well, the conventional wisdom in the West is that Russia attacked Ukraine because Vladimir Putin is an imperialist and he's interested in conquering Ukraine and making it part of a greater Russia, and then conquering countries in Eastern Europe, and in a very important way, recreating the Soviet Empire in Eastern Europe. That's the conventional wisdom. I believe it's wrong, and there's no evidence to support it. I believe what happened is that NATO decided in April 2008 to expand into Ukraine, to make Ukraine a part of NATO. Putin said at the time, this is unacceptable. It would be an existential threat to Russia, and we are not going to let it happen. In fact, we will destroy Ukraine before we will let it become a member of NATO. The West, and here we're talking mainly about the United States, refused to accept Putin's logic. And we continued to push, we meaning the West, and here again, the United States is the principal driving force. We moved forcefully to bring Ukraine into NATO. And Putin, on February 24th, 2022, allowed the Russian army to invade Ukraine and start the war that is ongoing. But this was a preventive war. It's very important to understand this. This was a preventive war. It was designed to prevent Ukraine from becoming a part of NATO. So all of this is a way of saying that the West is principally responsible for causing this war. Of course, it was the Russians who actually invaded Ukraine, but they would not have invaded Ukraine had the decision not been made in April 2008 to expand NATO into Ukraine. And I argue, just to finish here, that had NATO not moved in April 2008 to bring Ukraine into NATO, that Ukraine would be intact today in its pre-2014 borders. In other words, Crimea and those 4 oblasts in eastern Ukraine that the Russians have now annexed would all be part of Ukraine, were it not for that decision to expand NATO into Ukraine.
Yes, as it seems, the eastern border of Ukraine will change. What about the western border? Because there are claims maybe from Poland, from Romania, from Hungary about the western part of Ukraine. Could it become a NATO state territory through that kind of, annex from Hungary, Romania, or Poland?
Well, 2 points. Number one is I don't think that Putin will conquer all of Ukraine. I think that there will be a dysfunctional rump state in the western half of Ukraine once this war comes to an end. There will be a Ukrainian state. And I don't think that state will be a member of NATO. I think that the Europeans understand that if they push to bring that rump state, that Ukrainian rump state into NATO, that Putin would try to prevent it, just as he has tried to prevent Ukraine over the past few years from becoming part of NATO. 2, with regard to the question of whether countries like Poland or Romania would try to retake territory in Western Ukraine that formerly belonged to them, I don't think that's likely to happen. I don't think the Poles will try to take territory in Western Ukraine that was formerly part of Poland. And I think the United States would go to great lengths to prevent that if the Poles were tempted to do it. And so I don't see that happening.
The war in Ukraine is a proxy war, but proxy war between who? Between US and Russia, or between US and China?
No, I think it has nothing to do with China. I think this is a war between the United States and the West and Ukraine against Russia. But if you're talking about the great power dimension to it, I think it's the United States versus Russia. I think what the United States wanted to do was it wanted to knock Russia out of the ranks of the great powers. I think when the war started in February 2022, the United States thought over the course of that year, over the course of 2022, that it could win on the battlefield inside of Ukraine, right, using the Ukrainian military to beat the Russian army inside of Ukraine. And that, coupled with economic sanctions, would bring the Russians to their knees. The Russians would be defeated and they would surrender their great power status. And I think the Americans foolishly thought that was a good idea, and that was what they were pursuing. But of course, what happened was that Putin mobilized Russian resources, starting with the decision in September of 2002 to mobilize 300,000 Russian troops. And in the end, what happened is that the balance of power inside of Ukraine shifted against the Ukrainians and the West on one side, and shifted in favor of the Russians on the other side. So we now have a situation where the Russians are winning the war, which is very different than what we saw in 2022, the first year of the war. Then it looked like the Ukrainians might win against the Russians on the battlefield. And again, that coupled with sanctions would deliver a hammer blow to Russia, but that didn't work out.
On long term, who could be the winner of this war? I mean, of course, Russia achieved that Ukraine won't be the part of NATO, but Finland and Sweden join NATO.
I think that Finland and Sweden joining NATO doesn't matter much to the Russians. It doesn't add that much military capability. I think from the Russian point of view, the key was to make sure Ukraine did not become part of NATO. And Ukraine will not be part of NATO. And furthermore, Russia will have won the war that took place, or that is taking place now. So I think in the end, it will be a Russian victory. But as I like to say, it will be an ugly victory. This is not going to be a sweet victory. It's not like Russia's going to win decisively and live happily ever after. It will win a victory, and Ukraine will not become part of NATO. But there's going to be big trouble in Europe surrounding this conflict for a long time to come. So this is not a good situation. It would have been much better if NATO had not decided to try to bring Ukraine into the alliance in April 2008. That was, in my opinion, a catastrophic mistake.
Last Friday, Israel launched the Rising Lion operation. Why did Israel start this operation against Iran?
I think the main reason is that Iran has a nuclear enrichment capability. And if you can enrich uranium, which the Iranians can do, you can enrich uranium, it's easy to make a bomb. Now, I do not believe that the Iranians are attempting to build a nuclear weapon, right? The argument that they're racing to develop a nuclear weapon and they're close to developing a nuclear weapon is simply wrong. The Israelis argue that that's not the case. The Israelis argue that they're pursuing a nuclear weapon. They're going to have it very soon. I do not believe that's the case. But the Israelis are correct when they say that when they say that Iran has an enrichment capability and can achieve weaponization, nuclear weaponization. And what the Israelis want to do is prevent that from happening. They want to take away the enrichment capability. And I believe the principal reason that they started the war was they thought that the Israelis, had a window of opportunity to strike at Iran and destroy their enrichment capability. In other words, not destroy their burgeoning nuclear arsenal, because they are not pursuing nuclear weapons at this point in time. It's the mere fact that they have that enrichment capability that the Israelis wanted to eliminate, and that's why they attacked.
Israel also stated that they would like to change the regime in Iran. Could they do it?
I think that's, in my opinion, the secondary goal, to change the regime. And I don't think they can do it by attacking Iran. I think that what will happen instead, and indeed what is happening, is that the people of Iran will rally around the regime. There's no question that the regime is deeply disliked. The Iranian regime, the Ayatollahs are deeply disliked by the public, most of the public inside of Iran. But I think when the Israelis attack, and if the Americans are to attack with the Israelis, this will create what we call a rally around the flag effect. And I think the Ayatollahs will remain in power.
The West, as you mentioned several occasions before this interview, has misunderstood Putin's strategic interest or Russia's strategic interest. Do we understand Chinese one? Because China is like the biggest contender, the largest contender nowadays against the US, against the Western world.
Yeah, I think that what the Chinese want to do is they want to dominate East Asia the way the United States dominates the Western Hemisphere. They want to take back Taiwan. They want to dominate the East China Sea. They want to dominate the South China Sea. Indeed, they think they own the South China Sea. And although they don't say this publicly, they want to push the Americans out beyond the first island chain, then push the Americans out beyond the second island chain. And I want to be very clear here. I don't blame the Chinese at all. If I were Chinese, if I were the national security advisor to Xi Jinping, I'd tell him that what we want to do is we want to be a regional hegemon. We want to be the dominant power in East Asia. We want to be just like the Americans in the Western Hemisphere. So it makes perfect sense from China's point of view to want to dominate East Asia. And I believe that that's what they are attempting to do. I would note too that they're also building a blue water navy because they want to project power around the rest of the world. They want to have the military assets to protect the Belt and Road Initiative. And this makes perfect sense. The United States has a blue water navy. The United States projects power all over the planet. Why shouldn't the Chinese try to do the same thing? And of course, that's what they're doing. However, the problem is that the United States does not want China to dominate East Asia, and the United States does not want China to have power projection capability that will allow China to challenge the United States on the high seas and in other places around the world. So the United States is now in the process of trying to contain the growth of Chinese power, much the way we contained the Soviet Union during the Cold War. And of course, from a Chinese perspective, this is unacceptable. They don't want to be contained. They want to dominate East Asia. They want to have a blue water navy that can project power into the Persian Gulf. It's perfectly understandable from their point of view, but it's perfectly understandable from the American point of view that this is unacceptable. So I think what's going on here is clearly understood by the Americans. The Americans understand what the Chinese are up to. And I think the Chinese understand what the Americans are up to. But nevertheless, you're going to have this intense security competition between the two sides. Just as during the Cold War, you had an intense security competition between the United States and the Soviet Union. Let's hope that this security competition, this Cold War, never becomes a hot war. Because as you know, during the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union never ended up fighting each other. That was a wonderful thing. The last thing we wanted was a hot war between the two superpowers. And I think when you look at the US-China competition, the same basic logic applies. We don't want the United States and China to fight a great power war.
On Monday, if I remember it correctly, you mentioned that if you want to become a great power, you need population and you need wealth. Europe has both. How come that Europe isn't a great power nowadays?
It's very simple. Europe's not a country. If Europe united and became a country, then Europe would be a great power. It would be a superpower. But there's no evidence that Europe is going to unite. And certainly here in Hungary, the leadership has zero interest in a united Europe. The leadership here believes that Hungary is a sovereign state. I believe that in almost all European countries, the leaders believe that their country is a sovereign state. And as long as that's the case, as long as you have nationalism at play in European countries, and you do have nationalism at play, it's obviously a weaker force in some countries in Europe than it is in others. But the fact is that these are nation states. France, Germany, Britain, Hungary, these are all independent nation states. And you don't have a United States of Europe, and therefore it can never become a hegemon.
There are American troops and military bases for example, in Germany. Can Germany act rationally while they have American troops in German land?
Yes. I don't think it matters that much whether there are American troops there or not, in terms of whether Germany acts rationally. I think that one of the advantages of having American troops in Europe and in Germany in particular is that the American military presence serves as a pacifying force in Europe. I think that it's very important to understand that one of the reasons that you've had such cooperative relations among the various states in Europe, why you've been able to build this robust and vibrant European Union, is because of the American military presence. As long as the Americans are there, we serve as a pacifying force. And that allows European states to cooperate with each other. And that's what allows you to think about Europe as if it were a unified state. The reason that people like you talk about Europe as a unified state is in large part because of the EU, because of all this economic and even political integration that you have in Europe. And you have a substantial amount of it. I don't want to overstate the case, but that's what allows people to talk about Europe, right? It's what underpins all of this thinking about the EU as Europe.
The last question, in your point of view, what is Hungary's national interest?
Hungary's national interest basically is all about providing for the security of the country. Any Hungarian leader, whether it's Viktor Orban or someone else, has to think about what's the best way to maximize Hungarian security. And I believe the smart thing to do if you are Hungary is to act like a good realist, to think about the world in terms of balance of power. And if you're Hungary and you're a small state, right, and you have Russia nearby, and you also have to deal with the United States, you want to think about how to navigate in those treacherous waters, right? You don't want to pick a fight with the Russians. I think the Hungarians have thought much more smartly about how to deal with Russia than most Europeans have. And I think that most Hungarians, this is especially true of the Orban government, understand that the Russians have certain security interests. And if you begin to trespass on those security interests, you're going to get yourself into a lot of trouble. So I think if you're a country that's small, like Hungary, and you're geographically located in a dangerous area, you have to be very careful not to provoke a great power like Russia. Right? And I think moving forward, the Hungarians not only have to worry about how to deal with the Russians, I think they also have to worry about how to deal with the United States and China. If you accept my argument, as most people do at this point, that China and the United States are going to be engaged in a serious security competition, Hungary wants to think about how it's going to deal with that competition, because Hungary does a lot of economic intercourse with China. And it's likely in the future that Hungary will have significant economic relations with China. And the question is, how will the United States view this? And the Hungarians have to make sure, moving forward, that they maximize the amount of economic intercourse they do with the Chinese for purposes of facilitating prosperity and security in Hungary. But at the same time, they have to make sure, the Hungarian leaders, that they don't antagonize the United States. And that's, a tricky situation to be in, but it can be dealt with.
Mr. Mearsheimer, thanks a lot for.
Thank you for interviewing me. It was my pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.